Title: The Temple of Wind and the Wandering Hero. In the land of Aeolus, a realm where the winds whispered secrets and the sky was always in motion, there stood an ancient temple. A place said to be the cradle of the wind spirits. It was here that the winds met the earth, the sea, and the sky. The temple, hidden in the heart of a vast, ever-shifting desert, was a symbol of an old power. Few had ventured to seek it, and fewer still had returned. But legend told of a wandering hero, one who would cross the treacherous lands in search of the temple, seeking the wisdom of the winds to save his people. His name was Kalen, a young warrior from a distant village, whose heart was filled with both courage and a deep longing for answers. Kalen stood at the edge of his village, staring out across the desert. The winds swept past him, carrying with them the faintest whispers of a prophecy. He had heard the elders speak of the Temple of Wind, where the ancient spirits resided, holding the secrets to the world's greatest powers. His people were struggling. Drought had ravaged the land, crops had failed, and the spirits had grown silent. A voice in the wind called to him, a voice that spoke only to him. Kalen, the winds are waiting for you. The answers you seek lie beyond the storm. Without hesitation, Kalen packed his belongings and set forth, his heart filled with a burning desire to find the temple and unlock the mysteries hidden within its sacred walls. The desert stretched before him, an endless sea of sand under a sky that never seemed to settle. Days turned into weeks as Kalen wandered through the desert. The sun scorched his skin, and the winds, once inviting, had turned harsh and unforgiving. But Kalen pressed on, guided by the whispers of the wind, which seemed to push him forward when he faltered. One night, as he camped by the edge of a dry riverbed, a great storm suddenly appeared. The winds howled, the sky darkened, and Kalen could hear the roar of distant thunder. The storm raged, but within it, Kalen felt a presence, an ancient force, both wild and wise. "Do not fear the storm," the voice whispered to him, "for the wind is both your guide and your challenge. The Temple of Wind awaits, but the journey will not be easy. Only those who understand the wind's true nature can enter." Kalen's resolve grew stronger. He stood and faced the storm, knowing that the wind would be both his ally and his adversary. After countless trials, Kalen finally arrived at the entrance of the Temple of Wind. The massive stone doors stood before him, etched with intricate patterns of swirling gusts and ancient symbols. As he approached, a figure materialized from the mist, an ethereal being, the guardian of the temple. The guardian's voice was like the wind itself, soft yet powerful. "You have come far, young hero, but you must prove yourself worthy to enter. The wind tests all who seek its wisdom. Are you prepared to face the truth?" Kalen nodded. "I seek to understand the winds, to save my people. I will face whatever trials lie ahead." The guardian's eyes gleamed like the sky just before dawn. "Then let the trials begin." The first trial was one of silence. Kalen found himself standing in a vast hall, empty and still, save for the softest breeze that stirred the air. The voice of the wind had vanished, and Kalen felt an overwhelming sense of isolation. "Listen," the guardian's voice echoed in his mind. "The wind speaks in silence, in the pauses between the storms. Can you hear its message in the stillness?" Kalen closed his eyes and took a deep breath. Slowly, he began to listen not just to the physical winds, but to the deeper currents of the world. He heard the faint whispers of the earth, the heartbeat of the land, and the pulse of the sky. He understood that the wind carried more than just sound, it carried meaning, if only one was willing to listen. The silence was broken, and Kalen passed the first trial. Next, Kalen faced the trial of storms. He was transported to a vast open field, where the winds had become violent, tearing at the ground and threatening to tear him apart. Lightning flashed, and thunder boomed, shaking the very foundations of his resolve. "Face the storm, Kalen," the guardian commanded. "Do not fight against it, for the storm is part of you. Embrace it." Kalen hesitated, but then he remembered the wind's lessons. The storms were not to be feared, they were to be understood. He closed his eyes and spread his arms wide, letting the winds push against him. With each gust, he grew stronger, finding his balance amidst the chaos. The storm eventually subsided, and Kalen had passed the second trial. The final trial was the hardest of all. Kalen stood before a vast chasm, its depths shrouded in mist. On the other side of the chasm stood the temple, the answer to all his questions, the salvation of his people. But to cross, he would have to confront his deepest fears and doubts. The wind howled around him, urging him forward. But Kalen faltered. What if he failed? What if the journey had been for nothing? The voice of the wind spoke again, softer this time. "The wind carries all things joy and sorrow, hope and despair. You must trust your heart, Kalen, for the wind speaks to those who listen with love and courage." With a deep breath, Kalen took the first step into the chasm, his heart steady. The winds guided him, lifting him over the abyss. His fear dissolved, and he found himself standing before the Temple of Wind, ready to claim his destiny. Inside the temple, Kalen found the winds in their purest form. The ancient spirits spoke to him, revealing the secrets of the world, the balance between the earth, the sky, and the wind itself. They granted him the power to heal his land, to restore the balance that had been lost. Kalen returned to his village, carrying the wisdom of the winds. With the strength of the storm and the grace of the breeze, he brought rain to the parched earth, revived the crops, and restored hope to his people. The winds had chosen their hero, and the temple's whispers would live on, carried by the breeze for generations to come. Years passed since Kalen's return to his village, and the winds that once whispered through the desert now carried the tales of his courage. His people flourished, their lives restored by the wisdom he had brought from the Temple of Wind. The droughts ceased, the crops grew lush and bountiful, and the once silent winds now hummed with vitality. However, Kalen knew that his journey was not over. The Temple of Wind had given him a gift that was both a blessing and a responsibility. The winds had whispered another message, a warning that his role as a hero would not be forgotten, but would one day call upon him again. One fateful evening, as Kalen stood atop a cliff, watching the setting sun, the wind picked up once more. The voice of the guardian echoed in his mind. "Kalen, the winds are not done with you. There will come a time when the world will face a new trial, a trial that only you can face." The breeze gently tugged at his cloak, as if urging him to listen. Kalen's heart stirred with the knowledge that the peace he had fought for was fragile. The wind carried not just the promise of hope, but the challenge of inevitable change. Years after Kalen's return, a strange unease began to spread through the lands. The winds, once harmonious, began to grow erratic once again. Travelers spoke of sudden, violent storms that seemed to appear from nowhere, unshakable and destructive. The balance of the earth and sky seemed to be shifting, and whispers of an ancient enemy, long thought vanquished, began to stir. Kalen could feel it too. The storm that had once been a part of his trial now threatened the very world he had saved. His heart weighed heavy with the knowledge that his destiny was far from over. The Temple of Wind had called him once, and now it seemed it was time to answer again. He gathered his strength, determined to face whatever the winds had in store for him. The journey was not just one of power, it was a journey of understanding, of learning that the winds, like all forces of nature, were both creators and destroyers. There would be no simple solution, no easy victory. But Kalen was no longer the young warrior who had first set foot into the desert. He had become something more. Before setting out, Kalen knew he could not face the coming storm alone. He sought the help of those who had stood by him in the past, those who had witnessed his transformation from a wandering hero to a guardian of his people. Among them were his closest friends Lyra, a skilled healer who had once helped him navigate the desert's dangers, Brennan, a master of the elements whose powers were tied to the very winds Kalen had once tamed, and Alara, a former warrior whose strength had always matched Kalen's, and whose wisdom had guided him during the trials at the temple. Together, they set out across the desert, the winds now howling around them, as if urging them to hurry. The storm was coming, and the fate of the world was once again in their hands. As Kalen and his companions ventured deeper into the desert, they encountered strange phenomena. The winds grew wild and unpredictable, the very air crackling with unnatural energy. Sandstorms appeared and vanished in an instant, and the sky seemed to shift between day and night, as though the world itself was out of balance. At the heart of the desert, Kalen finally came face to face with the source of the disturbance, the spirit of the storm, a being of pure chaos and fury. This ancient force had once been sealed away by the winds of the temple. But now it had broken free, seeking to return the world to a state of constant conflict and destruction. "You are the one who sealed me away," the spirit growled, its voice a thunderous roar that shook the earth beneath Kalen's feet. "But you cannot stop me now. The winds are mine to control, and soon, the world will tremble under my power." Kalen stepped forward, his heart steady despite the raging storm. "The winds are not yours alone," he declared. "They belong to the earth, the sky, and the hearts of those who listen to their whispers. You cannot control what is meant to be free." The spirit of the storm laughed, a sound that echoed like crashing thunder. "We shall see, Kalen. We shall see." The battle that followed was unlike any Kalen had ever faced. The winds, once his ally, now turned against him, whipped into a frenzy by the spirit of the storm. Kalen and his companions fought with all their might, but the power of the storm seemed unstoppable. Lightning flashed, sand tore through the air, and the ground shook beneath their feet. But Kalen had learned from the winds. He knew that to face the storm, he could not fight it with sheer force. Instead, he embraced it, letting the wind guide his movements, understanding its fury and its grace. He called upon the power of the Temple of Wind, invoking the wisdom of the ancient spirits that had once tested him. With a mighty cry, Kalen summoned a gust of wind so powerful it split the storm in two, striking at the heart of the spirit of the storm. The spirit roared in agony as the winds, now aligned with Kalen's will, trapped it in a vortex, sealing it away once more. With the spirit of the storm banished, the desert slowly began to calm. The winds, no longer wild and destructive, settled into a gentle breeze once again. The sky cleared, and the sun rose over the horizon, casting its golden light on the land. Kalen stood in the midst of it all, his heart filled with both relief and sorrow. The winds had taught him many lessons over the years, and he knew that their work was never truly done. The world would always need those who were willing to listen, to understand, and to fight for balance. The Temple of Wind had been a place of trial, but it had also been a place of revelation. And Kalen, the wandering hero, had become its guardian. As he looked to the horizon, he knew that his journey was not over. The winds were always in motion, and so too was his destiny. Kalen's battle with the spirit of the storm had restored peace to the land, but as the winds settled into a gentle calm, Kalen felt the stirring of something deeper within him. He had fulfilled his destiny as the hero of his people, but the Temple of Wind had given him something. Marine understanding that his journey was not just about overcoming the forces of chaos, but about guiding others to find their own connection to the wind, to nature, and to the balance of all things. In the years that followed, Kaylin became a teacher, a mentor to the young, and a leader who helped his people understand that the true power of the wind was not in its fury, but in its harmony. He founded a new order, a group of scholars and warriors known as the Windward, who would protect the balance of the world and continue to study the winds and the forces that shaped the earth. But as Kaylin grew older, he knew that his time in the desert would eventually come to an end. The winds that had guided him all these years now whispered a new message, a call for a new hero, one who could carry the wisdom of the winds into the future. The prophecy of the wandering hero would be fulfilled again, but this time, it would not be Kaylin's name sung in the winds, but that of another. In a distant village, far beyond Kaylin's own, a young girl named Lyra listened to the winds as they whispered across the hills. She had always felt a strange connection to the wind, a pull in her heart that called her to the desert. Her people, much like Kaylin's, had suffered from drought and despair, and the land seemed to be slowly dying. The elders spoke of the ancient temple of wind, and the hero who had once ventured to its heart to restore balance. But Lyra had never been one to wait for stories to unfold. Her curiosity and inner fire pushed her to seek out the truth for herself. She had heard the whispers of the winds, and she knew that they were calling her to something greater. One evening, as the sun dipped beneath the horizon, the wind carried the voice of Kaylin to Lyra, though he had long since passed from the physical world. "The winds have guided you, Lyra," the voice said, soft yet resolute. "The time has come for you to seek the temple. Your path will not be easy, but it is your destiny to protect the winds, to understand them, and to guide the world once again." Lyra's journey began as Kaylin's had, with uncertainty and a sense of profound responsibility. She traversed the desert, guided by the whispers in the wind, learning to listen to the subtle currents that flowed through the land. Along the way, she met other travelers, each with their own stories of the wind's influence on their lives. Some had been saved by the winds, while others had lost everything to its fury. Lyra understood that the wind was both a blessing and a curse, a force that must be respected and understood in order to coexist with it. As she reached the Temple of Wind, Lyra felt a deep connection to the place. The ancient stones, carved with the same swirling symbols Kaylin had seen, seemed to pulse with a power that was both ancient and new. The winds whispered her name, and she knew that she had arrived at the place where her true test would begin. Just as Kaylin had encountered the Guardian, so too did Lyra face the same ancient being. The Guardian appeared before her, its form shifting with the wind, as though it was made of the very air itself. "You have come, young one," the Guardian said. "The winds have called you, but you must prove that you are worthy of their trust. To do so, you must pass the 3 trials." Lyra nodded, her resolve unwavering. She had heard the stories, and she had prepared herself for this moment. She was not only seeking knowledge for herself, but for her people, and for the future of the world. The first trial was one of strength, testing her ability to withstand the fierce winds that threatened to tear her apart. Lyra stood her ground, trusting in the winds and in her own resilience. The second trial was one of wisdom, as the winds presented her with riddles and challenges that tested her mind. Lyra's sharp intellect and her deep connection to the world around her allowed her to see beyond the surface, answering the riddles with ease. The third and final trial was the most difficult of all, the trial of the heart. Lyra was faced with a vision of her village, struggling under the weight of a new storm that threatened to consume everything she held dear. The winds asked her to choose between her own desires and the future of her people. Lyra's heart ached as she realized that she could never have both the power of the winds and the safety of her people. But in that moment, she understood what Kaylin had learned before her: the true power of the wind was not in possession, but in the balance it created. With a steady heart, Lyra made her choice. She would carry the wisdom of the wind, but never use it for personal gain. She would share the knowledge, the gifts of the winds, with those who sought to protect the balance of nature. Lyra passed the trials, her connection to the wind stronger than ever before. The guardian nodded in approval, and the winds sang their praises. "You have learned the true lesson of the wind," the guardian said. "You are worthy of the knowledge you seek. Now, it is your turn to become the keeper of the winds, to guide the world as Kaelin did before you." Lyra returned to her village, where she shared the wisdom she had gained. She taught her people to respect the winds, to live in harmony with the earth and sky, and to understand that the true power of nature lay in its balance, not in its control. And so, the legacy of the wind continued, passed down through generations, as Kaelin's name became a legend carried on the breeze. The Temple of Wind remained a symbol of the wisdom of the ages, a place where the winds spoke to those who would listen, guiding the world into a new era. As years passed, Lyra's wisdom spread beyond her village. Her teachings about balance, respect for the elements, and the delicate dance between the forces of nature became a guiding light for all who sought understanding. Yet, in the deepest corners of the desert, rumors began to stir, whispers of a dark force rising from the forgotten places of the world. A force that sought to disrupt the balance Lyra had worked so hard to restore. One night, while meditating beneath the stars, Lyra felt a strange chill in the wind. The air grew heavy, and the wind, once gentle and comforting, began to carry a bitter taste. A voice echoed in the depths of her Minda voice she knew all too well, though it had been silent for many years. "Lyra," the voice whispered, "the balance you have fought for is threatened. A new storm is coming, one far greater than any you faced before. The winds of prophecy are calling you, as they called Kaelin before you. You must go to the heart of the storm and prevent it from consuming the world." Lyra knew, deep within her soul, that her next journey was about to begin. With a heavy heart, Lyra gathered her most trusted allies: Zephyr, a young wind mage who had once been her student; Theron, a silent warrior whose strength was as unyielding as the desert itself; and Nia, a gifted healer whose connection to the earth was as profound as Lyra's own connection to the wind. Together, they ventured into the desert, following the whispers of the wind that now seemed to beckon them toward an unknown destination. As they journeyed deeper into the heart of the desert, the once familiar landscape began to shift. The sand seemed to twist and change, as if the very earth was being warped by the unseen force that threatened to tear the world apart. A sense of foreboding hung in the air, and the winds that had once been their allies now howled with a ferocity that threatened to overwhelm them. Lyra's heart tightened as she realized that this storm, this new trial, would not be overcome with the same wisdom and patience that had guided her before. The winds had grown dark, and their whispers now carried a warning of a coming force, so powerful that it could unravel everything she had worked to protect. After days of travel, Lyra and her companions reached a long-forgotten temple deep within the desert. Unlike the Temple of Wind, which had stood as a beacon of wisdom and light, this temple was shrouded in darkness. Its once glorious halls now twisted and decaying. The air was thick with the weight of ancient power, and Lyra felt the oppressive presence of something malevolent stirring within. "This is the Temple of Shadows," Nia whispered, her voice barely audible. "A place lost to time, where the winds were once harnessed for darker purposes. This is where the storm is being born." As they ventured further into the temple, the shadows seemed to grow deeper, and the winds began to howl louder, as though warning them to turn back. But Lyra knew that the heart of the storm lay ahead, and there was no turning back. At the heart of the temple, they found the source of the disturbance: a dark, swirling vortex of wind, its energy chaotic and raw, pulling everything in its path toward an unseen center. At the center of the vortex stood a figure, cloaked in shadow, its face obscured by the darkness. "You've come," the figure's voice boomed, a deep, resonant sound that shook the very foundation of the temple. "I have been waiting for you, Lyra. The winds you cherish, the balance you protect, they will all be mine." Lyra stepped forward, her heart calm despite the swirling storm around her. "I will not allow you to destroy what has been built. The winds are not yours to control." The shadowed figure laughed, a sound like 1,000 storms crashing together. "The winds belong to no one, Lyra. They are forces of destruction and creation, and I will use them to reshape the world as I see fit." The air around them crackled with energy as the vortex of wind grew stronger, its power threatening to tear apart everything in its path. Lyra could feel the pull of the storm, its dark energy attempting to overwhelm her. But she stood firm, her resolve unshaken. She reached deep within herself, calling upon the teachings of Kaelin and the wisdom of the wind. She felt the gentle pulse of the earth beneath her feet, the steady rhythm of the world that had once been in harmony. She knew that to defeat this darkness, she could not fight with force or anger. She had to return to the balance that had always been at the heart of the wind's true power. Lyra stretched out her hands, her fingers glowing with the pure light of the winds she had learned to command. The dark vortex twisted and writhed, but it could not match the harmony of the winds Lyra controlled. With a cry, she released the full force of her power, not as a weapon, but as a force of nature, gentle, yet unstoppable. The storm trembled, and the shadowed figure recoiled, its power faltering. "No," it shouted, but it was too late. The balance of the wind, restored by Lyra's unwavering spirit, consumed the darkness, unraveling it piece by piece. As the last of the shadow faded into the air, Lyra stood, breathing heavily, her heart racing. The wind, once again, was calm. The storm was gone. With the storm defeated, Lyra and her companions returned to their village, the winds now carrying a message of hope and renewal. The storm had been a trial, a reminder of the delicate balance between creation and destruction, light and dark. Lyra knew that the winds would always carry both forces, but it was up to those who understood them to ensure that the world remained in harmony. In the years that followed, Lyra continued her work as the guardian of the winds, teaching the next generation to listen, to respect, and to live in balance with the world around them. The winds would always be a part of her, as they had been a part of Kaelin, and as they would be a part of the future. And so, the cycle continued, the winds, ever changing, ever whispering, carrying the legacy of those who had come before and those who would come after. Years passed, and the desert began to heal. The storms that had once raged with fury now seemed to gently ebb and flow, in harmony with the land. Lyra's teachings had taken root, and her village prospered, guided by the wisdom of the wind. But as the world healed, Lyra knew that the winds were not simply a force to be controlled, they were a living testament to the eternal cycle of change, a reminder that nothing ever truly remains still. One evening, as the sun set and the desert winds began to stir once more, Lyra sat atop a hill, looking out toward the horizon. A faint breeze carried a whisper, a message from the depths of the winds, one she had never felt before. "Lyra, the time has come for you to journey beyond," the voice said, a familiar yet distant tone. "The winds are calling you to a place no one has dared to go. The balance of the world is shifting once again, and new guardians must rise to face the challenges that lie ahead." Lyra's heart quickened. She had sensed that this day would come, but she had not expected it so soon. She had spent her life studying the winds, listening to their whispers, and guiding her people. But there was still much she did not know. The winds were a vast, untamed force, and there were places in the world where even the most seasoned travelers dared not go. The message was clear. A new journey awaited her, one that would take her beyond the borders of the known world. Lyra gathered her closest allies once more: Zephyr, now a master of the wind magic; Theron, who had become a legendary protector of the land; and Nia, whose healing abilities had grown to extraordinary levels. Together, they set out to follow the call of the winds, which led them beyond the deserts they knew, into lands that were shrouded in mystery and myth. Their path took them through forgotten forests, across mountains that seemed to pierce the heavens, and into valleys where the winds whispered of ancient secrets. In the heart of one such valley, they found the ruins of an ancient city, long abandoned by time. It was said to be the birthplace of the winds themselves, a place where the first breath of the air had been shaped by those who came before. At the center of the ruins, Lyra found an ancient temple, its stones etched with symbols older than any she had encountered. As she stepped inside, the winds seemed to swirl around her, as if welcoming her to this sacred place. On the walls, she saw a depiction of a song that had been passed down through the ages. A song that was said to hold the key to understanding the true nature of the winds. "The winds sing the song of the world," Zephyr murmured, studying the markings on the walls. "Perhaps this is what we've been seeking." Lyra approached the stone altar at the heart of the temple, her mind racing. She knew that the winds were not just forces of nature, they were carriers of stories, of histories long forgotten. The ancient song that was carved into the temple was more than just a melody. It was a key, a map to understanding the very essence of the winds and their connection to the balance of the world. As Lyra placed her hands upon the altar, a wave of energy surged through her, and the winds began to sing. The song, though silent to the human ear, was felt in the very core of her being. It was a melody older than time itself, carrying within it the knowledge of the wind's origins, their power, and the role they played in shaping the world. The song spoke of the ancient ones, the first beings who had learned to harness the winds, not just as a force, but as a life-giving energy that flowed through the land. They had created the wind temples, the sacred places where the balance of the world was maintained. But the song also spoke of a time when the winds had been corrupted, when dark forces had sought to control them, twisting their power for destruction. Lyra closed her eyes, letting the song wash over her. She understood now that the winds were not just a force of nature, they were a living memory, a reflection of the world's past, present, and future. They were the keepers of balance, and it was her responsibility, and that of the next generation, to protect them. The winds, now calm, whispered their final message. "You have learned the song," they said. "Now, you must pass it on." Lyra's journey had come full circle. She had learned the true nature of the winds, and with this knowledge, she knew that her work was far from over. The world was vast, and there were still many places where the winds were misunderstood or misused. She could not protect them alone. As she returned to her village, she began to pass on the teachings of the winds to a new generation of young heroes. Among them was a young boy named Eric, whose heart was as fierce as the wind itself. He had been born into a world where the winds were no longer feared, but revered. He was eager to learn, to understand, and to one day follow in Lyra's footsteps. Lyra could see in him the same fire that had once burned within her. She began to teach him the ancient song, the secrets of the wind, and the importance of balance. She knew that the winds would one day call upon him, just as they had called upon her. And so, the cycle continued. The winds, ever changing, ever present, would always find new guardians to protect them. The legacy of the Windkeepers was eternal, and with each new generation, the song would be sung again, carried by the winds, across the lands, through time, and into the future. Eric, now a young man, stood at the edge of the sacred desert where the winds first spoke to Lyra. He had spent years in training under her careful guidance, learning to listen to the whispers of the wind and to understand its language. Lyra had passed on the ancient song, and with it, the understanding that the winds were not merely a natural force, but an embodiment of balance and memory. Yet, despite all the knowledge he had gained, Eric could not shake the feeling that something was amiss. The winds, once so clear and true, had begun to carry a new, unsettling energy, a dark undertone that seemed to echo from places long forgotten. One evening, as he meditated beneath the stars, he felt it again whisper in the wind, but this time, it was not a message of peace. It was a cry for help, distant and desperate, calling from the heart of the world. "The winds are restless," the voice in the wind murmured. "There is a place, lost to time, where the winds were once torn asunder. You must find it, Eric, and restore what has been broken." Eric's heart clenched. He had heard stories of the forgotten winds that had once been corrupted and torn apart by an ancient power. It was said that these winds had been sealed away in a hidden temple, lost deep within the mountains that bordered the world's edge. No one had dared venture there, for it was believed that those who sought the forgotten winds would never return. But Eric knew that if he was to be the guardian of the winds, he could not ignore the call. He had to find the forgotten temple and uncover its secrets, no matter the cost. Eric gathered his most trusted allies for this dangerous journey. Among them was Mira, a fierce warrior with unmatched skill in battle, and Ellis, a gifted scholar who had spent her life studying the ancient texts of the wind temples. Together, they set out on a path that would lead them into the heart of the mountains, through treacherous landscapes and forgotten ruins. The winds were strange as they traveled. The gentle breeze that once guided them seemed to be pushing them forward, yet there was an ominous undertone to it, an invisible force that urged them toward the unknown. The closer they got to the temple, the stronger the pull became, and Eric could feel the weight of the forgotten winds pressing down on him. Finally, after days of perilous travel, they arrived at the entrance to the Forbidden Temple. It was a massive structure, carved into the mountainside, with towering stone pillars that seemed to stretch toward the sky. But the temple was silent, eerily so. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness, and the winds, once so full of life, now seemed suffocated within its walls. "This is it," Eric whispered. "The forgotten winds are here. We must restore them." With a deep breath, he stepped forward, and the doors of the temple creaked open, revealing a dark chamber within. Inside the temple, the air was heavy with ancient magic. The walls were adorned with carvings that told stories of a time long past, stories of winds that had been corrupted by dark forces, torn from their natural flow and bound within the temple's heart. At the center of the temple stood a massive stone altar, surrounded by swirling vortexes of dark wind. These winds were unlike any Eric had ever felt. They were not the winds of nature, but the winds of chaos, swirling in a maddening dance that threatened to consume everything in their path. Alice stepped forward, her eyes scanning the symbols carved into the altar. "These winds were sealed here long ago," she said. "But something has broken the seal. The balance has been disturbed." Eric nodded. He could feel it. Tooth winds were not just in turmoil, they were angry, and they craved release. "We must restore the balance," Eric said firmly. "The winds were never meant to be contained. They are meant to flow freely, in harmony with the world." Mira unsheathed her sword, standing ready to protect the others. "How do we restore the balance? The winds have been corrupted for centuries. Can we really undo all the damage?" Eric closed his eyes, remembering the teachings of Lyra, the wisdom of Kaelin, and the ancient song of the winds. The winds were not mere elements to be controlled, they were reflections of the world itself. To restore balance, they had to remind the winds of their true nature, to reconnect them to the rhythm of life. He raised his arms, calling upon the winds of the earth, the skies, and the oceans. Slowly, a gentle breeze began to stir, swirling around him, growing stronger with each breath. The winds of chaos began to resist, fighting against him, but Eric was determined. He chanted the ancient song, the melody that had been passed down through generations. At first, nothing changed. But then, a soft light began to glow from the heart of the temple, and the winds of chaos slowly started to settle. The vortexes began to calm, their wild spinning turning into gentle currents of air, flowing in harmony with the world once more. As the last of the dark winds dissipated, the temple seemed to come alive. The air grew fresh, filled with the sweet scent of the earth and the promise of renewal. The forgotten winds had been freed, no longer bound by the chains of darkness that had held them captive for so long. Eric stood, breathless, but triumphant. The winds had been restored, and with them, the balance of the world. "It is done," Alice said, her voice filled with awe. "The winds are free once again." Mira clapped him on the back, a smile on her face. "You did it, Eric. The world is in your hands now." But Eric knew that the winds were not his to control. They were a force of nature, a reflection of the world's balance. He was merely their guardian, tasked with protecting that balance and ensuring that the winds continued to flow freely, for as long as the world existed. As Eric and his companions made their way back to the village, the winds carried a new song, a song of renewal, of harmony, and of hope. The world had been changed, and a new era had begun. The winds, once again, were free to dance across the lands, bringing with them the promise of a brighter future. And as the sun set over the horizon, Eric stood at the edge of the desert, feeling the winds on his face. He knew that his journey was far from over. There would always be new challenges, new forces to face, and new winds to protect. But he was ready to follow the song of the winds, wherever it would lead. The winds, eternal and ever-changing, would always find new guardians to carry their song. As Eric continued to guide the winds of the world, he realized that their power was not bound by time or place. The winds were ancient, eternal, and they carried the stories of those who had come before. But they also carried whispers of a coming storm, a force that threatened not only the winds, but the entire world itself. In the days following the restoration of the forgotten winds, strange phenomena began to occur. The winds shifted unpredictably, becoming wild and violent, as though warning of an approaching danger. Eric and his companions could feel the growing unrest in the air. Even the most peaceful of winds seemed to carry an undertone of unease. One night, as Eric sat by the fire, the wind spoke to him once more. "Eric," the voice whispered, this time faint but urgent. "There is a storm gathering, one that no guardian has faced before. It comes from the heart of the world, where the winds are born. You must journey to the eye of the storm and face what lies within. Only then can you restore the balance." Eric's heart sank. The eye of the storm was a place of legend, said to be where the winds were born and where they could be unraveled. No one had ever returned from there, and the idea of facing such an unknown force was both terrifying and exhilarating. With no time to waste, Eric gathered his companions. They set out once again, traveling through lands now touched by the storm's far-reaching influence. The once tranquil winds had turned fierce, howling across the world with a power that seemed almost sentient. The storm was coming, and it would not be ignored. The journey was long and treacherous, as the group made their way toward the eye of the storm, a place hidden in the deepest, most desolate corner of the world. The winds grew stronger with each passing day, a constant reminder of the force they were about to face. Trees were uprooted, the sky darkened with swirling clouds, and the land seemed to tremble beneath their feet. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they arrived at the edge of the eye of the storm. It was not a place of calm, as its name would suggest. Instead, it was a chaotic, swirling vortex of wind and energy, a maelstrom of such intensity that it seemed to warp the very fabric of reality. At the center of the storm stood a massive stone pillar, towering high above them, its surface covered in ancient runes. This was the source, the place where the winds were born, and where they could be undone. "We must enter the storm," Eric said, his voice steady despite the overwhelming power surrounding them. "The balance of the world depends on it." Mira nodded, her eyes steely with resolve. "Then we shall face it together." With that, they entered the storm, each step taken with caution as they made their way toward the stone pillar. The winds lashed at them, but Eric could feel the ancient power of the winds guiding them forward, as if the storm itself was testing their resolve. As they reached the base of the pillar, a sudden calm fell over them. The winds seemed to pause, and the storm's fury diminished, as if it was waiting for something. Eric stepped forward, placing his hand on the pillar. The runes began to glow, their light pulsating with a rhythm that mirrored his heartbeat. The winds around them began to settle, forming a steady, almost melodic breeze. It was then that Eric understood the storm was not a force to be feared, but a force to be understood. As Eric stood before the pillar, the winds began to speak not as a whisper, but as a voice, deep and resonant, echoing in his mind. "You have come to the heart of the storm," the voice said. "But you have come not to destroy, but to understand. The storm is not an enemy, it is a guardian, one that holds the balance of the world. It was not meant to be tamed, but to be honored. The winds were always meant to flow freely, but their course has been disturbed." Eric listened intently, understanding that this was no mere test, it was a revelation. The storm, the winds, the balance of the world, they were all part of something much greater than he had ever imagined. The storm was not a threat to the world, but a part of its cycle, a necessary force to restore harmony when it was lost. "What must I do?" Eric asked, his voice firm. The winds spoke again, this time with a sense of finality. "You must become the stormkeeper, the one who holds the storm's heart. You must learn to guide the winds, not as a master, but as a partner. The storm will no longer rage against the world, but will return to its natural flow. The balance can only be restored when you understand this." Eric closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the storm surrounding him. He realized that this was not a challenge of power, but of humility. The winds, the storm, and the world were not his to control. He was but a part of a much larger whole, and his role was to guide, not dominate. As he reached out with his mind, he felt the storm begin to shift. The winds no longer lashed at him, they welcomed him, recognizing his intent. Slowly, the storm began to dissipate, its fury turning into a gentle, steady wind. The pillar's runes glowed brighter, and the winds around them began to take on a peaceful rhythm, restoring balance to the world. The storm was no longer a force of destruction. It was a force of restoration, a vital part of the world's cycle, now returned to its natural flow. With the storm's heart calmed, Eric and his companions returned to their homeland. The winds were peaceful once again, and the balance of the world had been restored. But Eric knew that this was only the beginning. The storm would return, as all forces of nature do, but with a new understanding, the guardians of the wind would be ready. Eric had become the stormkeeper, not through force, but through understanding. The winds, once wild and uncontrollable, were now part of a greater harmony, and it was his responsibility to ensure that balance was maintained. As he stood at the edge of the desert, the winds once again danced around him, carrying with them the promise of new beginnings. Eric looked to the horizon, knowing that his journey was far from over. The winds would always need a guardian, and he was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. After the storm was tamed, and balance was restored to the winds of the world, Eric stood atop the cliffs. where the wind whispered the ancient secrets of the earth. His heart was lighter than it had ever been before, yet a part of him felt restless. The winds were peaceful, but they carried with them an undertone of urgency, a call that Eric could not ignore. Mira, his loyal companion, stood by his side, sensing his unease. "What troubles you, Eric? We have done what was needed. The winds are at peace, for now." Eric looked to the horizon, his gaze drawn to the distant mountains where the winds stirred in strange patterns, as if beckoning him. "I feel there is something more, a force we have yet to understand. The winds do not speak of calm forever. There is still something in the air, something forgotten, waiting to be uncovered." Mira nodded solemnly. "Then we must go, and uncover it. If the winds speak, we must listen." Together, they set off towards the distant mountains, where the winds seemed to grow stronger. The land around them began to change, the air becoming thick with a strange energy, as if the very earth was holding its breath. It was a land untouched by the storms they had encountered before, pristine, yet mysterious. After days of travel, they reached a hidden cave high in the mountains. The entrance was barely visible, concealed by dense mist and overgrown vines. As they ventured inside, the temperature dropped, and a sense of ancient power filled the air. The winds inside the cave were different, soft, but tinged with a haunting, almost melancholy note. As they moved deeper into the cave, the walls began to shimmer with faint lights, like stars scattered across the stone. They were not merely lights, but ancient runes, glowing with the memory of long-forgotten winds. "It is here," Eric whispered. "This is where the winds were born." The whispers of the forgotten winds echo within these walls. At the far end of the cave stood a large stone altar, carved with intricate symbols and surrounded by swirling winds. The winds that circled the altar felt heavier, laden with a sense of grief and longing. Eric approached cautiously, feeling the weight of centuries of silence pressing down on him. Suddenly, the winds grew stronger, and a voice, deep and ancient, resonated in the cave. "You have come, Stormkeeper," the voice boomed, reverberating through the stone. "You seek the forgotten winds, but they are not easily uncovered. To awaken them, you must confront the memories of the past." The winds howled around them, and the cave seemed to shake as if the very earth was coming alive. Eric's heart pounded in his chest, but he stood firm, sensing the power that lay ahead. "Who are you?" Eric called out, his voice steady. "What do you want from me?" The voice echoed back, its tone both sad and powerful. "I am the keeper of the forgotten winds, the spirit of those who have been lost to time. I guard the winds that were once forgotten, winds that carried the memories of the world. You seek them, but you must first understand why they were lost." A whirlwind of memories surged around Eric, visions of forgotten lands, lost civilizations, and ancient guardians who had once protected the winds. He saw the rise and fall of empires, the storms that had ravaged the earth, and the moments when the winds had been silenced, when the balance of nature had been broken. "The winds were not always as they are," the voice continued. "Once, they were free, flowing with the rhythm of the world. But greed, fear, and conflict clouded the skies, and the winds were bound. They were hidden away, forgotten, as the world turned inward, consumed by its own darkness." Eric closed his eyes, feeling the weight of this history. The winds had not always been a force of balance, they had once been something more, something pure. But they had been lost to time, their true purpose forgotten. "To restore them, you must face the truth of their loss," the voice said. "You must confront the darkness that led to their imprisonment. Only then can you release them." The winds grew colder, and the shadows in the cave deepened. Eric felt the pressure of the cave's ancient power, a force that challenged him to confront his deepest fears. Mira stood by his side, her presence a steadying force, but even she could sense the gravity of what Eric was about to face. The winds began to swirl violently, and a shadowy figure materialized before Eric. It was not a physical being, but a manifestation of the darkness that had once bound the winds, a force of hatred, fear, and forgotten memories. "You seek to release the winds," the figure whispered, its voice cold and full of malice. "But first, you must face the darkness within yourself. You are the stormkeeper, but you are not free of the shadows that have shaped this world." Eric stepped forward, unshaken by the figure's presence. "I am no stranger to darkness," he said firmly. "I have seen the destruction it causes, and I have learned to fight it. The winds will be free, and I will not be consumed by fear." The shadow smirked, its form shifting like smoke. "Then prove it. Prove that you can face the truth of the past without letting it consume you. Only then will the winds be set free." With those words, the darkness surged forward, engulfing Eric in a whirlwind of memories, moments of loss, betrayal, and fear. The cave seemed to come alive with these painful echoes, but Eric remained resolute. He remembered the lessons he had learned from the winds, the importance of balance, of understanding the forces at play, of never giving in to fear. With a deep breath, Eric focused on the winds around him, calling on their power to guide him. The storm within him calmed, and the darkness began to fade. "I will not be consumed," Eric whispered. "The winds are not mine to control, but to guide. I release the past, and with it, the power to heal." The shadow dissolved, and the winds grew still. With the darkness dispelled, the winds in the cave began to shift, their energy growing lighter and more harmonious. The runes on the altar glowed brighter, and the winds surrounding Eric and Mira swirled with the power of the forgotten ones. The winds that had been lost to time were returning to their rightful place. "You have faced the darkness and understood the wind's true nature," the voice of the keeper said. "The forgotten winds are now free, and so is the world. You have restored balance once more." Eric stood tall, feeling the winds surrounding him in their purest form. The storms that had once ravaged the world were now a force of healing, flowing freely and without fear. As the winds whispered their thanks, Eric turned to Mira, his heart full of peace. "The winds are free again. The world is whole." And with that, they left the cave, knowing that the winds would carry the world toward a new era of balance, a time of healing, growth, and harmony. The winds would always be there, but now, they would always be free. As Eric and Mira made their way down from the mountain, they could feel the winds changing. The air was lighter, filled with a fresh energy that seemed to sweep through the land with every step they took. It was as if the world itself was breathing again, renewed by the freedom of the forgotten winds. The landscape around them had transformed. Where once there had been barren lands ravaged by storms, there were now vibrant fields of wildflowers, and rivers flowed crystal clear. The birds sang in chorus, and the trees whispered their thanks to the winds that had once again returned to their rightful place. "Look," Mira said, pointing to the horizon where the sun was rising. "The world is healing." Eric looked toward the rising sun, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. The winds were no longer a force of destruction, they were a force of life. The balance had been restored, and the harmony between the earth and the skies was stronger than ever. Yet, there was a part of Eric that knew this was not the end. The winds, though free, had shared with him their ancient wisdom that had been hidden for so long. And that wisdom carried a responsibility. After days of travel, they returned to the village where their journey had begun. The people who had once feared the storms now welcomed them as heroes. The winds no longer brought chaos, but rather peace, as the villagers found themselves living in harmony with the natural world around them. But Eric knew that the winds carried more than just power, they carried the stories of the world, the lessons of the past, and the potential for the future. And with that knowledge, Eric knew that his role as the stormkeeper was not just to tame the winds, but to guide them to ensure that they continued to carry life, not destruction. One evening, as Eric stood on a hill overlooking the village, the winds began to stir again, gently this time, as if calling to him. He closed his eyes and listened. They were not the same winds he had battled so long ago. They were wiser, calmer, and full of purpose. Mira joined him, sensing his thoughts. "What is it, Eric?" "The winds are calling me," Eric said softly. "They have more to teach. And I must continue to listen. My journey is not yet finished." Mira nodded, her expression understanding. "Then we will go together. Wherever the winds take us." With the winds at their backs, Eric and Mira set off once more, knowing that their path would be ever-changing, ever-growing. The world had changed, and so had they. Eric had learned to listen to the whispers of the winds, not just to control them, but to understand them, to help guide them toward balance. As they traveled, Eric shared the lessons he had learned with the people they met. The winds were no longer something to be feared, they were a source of wisdom and healing. People from distant lands came to learn from Eric, to hear the stories of the forgotten winds and the ancient power that had been unlocked. Eric's journey became a legacy. The winds, once bound by darkness, now carried stories of peace, of growth, of the balance between all things. The world had entered a new age, one where the elements were no longer at odds with each other, but worked together in harmony. And so, Eric, the stormkeeper, became a symbol of hope and renewal, a reminder that even the most powerful forces, when understood and respected, could bring about change. The winds would always whisper their secrets, and Eric would always listen, guiding them as they carried the world forward into a new dawn. Years passed, and the winds continued to flow freely across the world. The once desolate lands were now filled with life, and the people lived in peace with the forces of nature. Eric, now an elder, stood once more at the edge of the cliff where his journey had begun. He closed his eyes and felt the winds as they whispered through the trees, carrying with them the stories of the past, the lessons of the present, and the promises of the future. And as the sun set, casting its golden light over the world, Eric smiled. He had done what he set out to do. The winds were free. The world was free. And so, the story of the stormkeeper came to an end, not with a final victory, but with a continued journey. The winds would always be there, guiding those who knew how to listen, reminding them of the balance that must always be maintained. The winds were free, and so was the world.